Hello and welcome to Rushing the Field, a weekly national college football podcast from NBC Sports. It's actually more than weekly right now because we are here to bring you live reactions to CFP Rankings, and we will definitely have a full show for you on Selection Sunday as well. But this is the penultimate rankings. These are the ones where we pretty much have a good idea of who is in and who is looking at being out. He's Joshua Perry. I'm Nicole Auerbach. And Joshua, we need to get into this because all month, right? We've been all wondering who's going to get the last spot, who's going to be the last at-large team that gets into the bracket. Now, with just a few teams that are going to play this weekend with conference championships, it's Alabama. Very familiar name, familiar brand, familiar team, just a different coach this year. But Alabama, last team in, Miami, first team out. Your reaction?
I mean, first off, I thought we were going to be doing something different here. I thought we were, we're going to be debating so many other teams rather than like, should Alabama be in with 3 losses? But here we are. And frankly, like that Alabama, Ole Miss, South Carolina kind of, ranking conundrum, like it makes sense that Alabama would be the team based off of some of the results that we've seen on the field there. But like, it feels anticlimactic that the last at-large spot, we're talking about one of the blue bloods who has won multiple national championships in the playoff era.
Yep.
But this is where we're at.
Yeah, I've had them in my projection and talked it out through the weekend. I feel like by the time we all went to bed on Saturday night, we all thought it was going to be Alabama based on the committee just really liking Alabama. They give them a lot of credit for their 3 top 20 wins. Yeah. And they really don't ding them much for their losses, even though they have 2 bad losses. The Vandy loss is a bad one, and the Oklahoma one is even worse. It was later in the season, and it was a blowout. But other teams, I would even say Ohio State didn't get dinged very much for its loss to a mediocre team, right? And so if Alabama's not, Ohio State's not, it is tempting to say that the brand name and just the committee's feeling about these teams is really carrying the day. And I think it's the case for both of them, but definitely Alabama.
Totally agree. And like, I think you can justify away the lack of the drop for Alabama and Ohio State. And you're like, 2 top 10 wins for Ohio State, as you mentioned, 3 top 20 wins for Alabama. But it does bring up the question from earlier in the year. Georgia loses, and it's like free fall for Georgia. And we're having the conversation like, oh, man, do they even make it in? And it has been very inconsistent the way that they've done it. But I do think, to your point, like, as this has started to round out, there's certainly benefit of the doubt for some of the name brands. I'm sitting here with my wife watching the rankings release, and she's like, really? 4 spots? It's all they dropped to losing to a Michigan team with a quarterback threw for 62 yards on the day that they lost, but this is the world we're in.
Yeah, it's a great point. And, Indiana's a beneficiary of that too, right? They still stayed in after losing to Ohio State. Penn State is all the way up to the number 3 overall seed. It's as if their loss to Ohio State never happened. That actually got weakened. Their resume got weakened by Ohio State losing to Michigan. Nothing happened. They're still above Notre Dame for inexplicable reasons because I think we're both confused by that one. Yeah. But the ordering of the teams in that, last team in, first team out, really the bubble is interesting because, we have grouped those 3-loss SEC teams together in a lot of ways, right? Alabama, Ole Miss, and then South Carolina. South Carolina picks up a big win over Clemson, who's now playing for an ACC championship. But those head-to-head losses to Alabama and Ole Miss are basically boxing them out of the playoff right now. I thought the only way that the committee could justify it was if you said, hey, that win over Clemson was so good, and then we'll put Miami after you, so there's a little bit of a buffer, and head-to-head didn't apply here. Or the Alabama game was so long ago, you're a different team since then, right? Like one of those go-to reasons for the committee, they didn't do that. So South Carolina is now out. Ole Miss is out, and they're upset because Lane Kiffin has been out here for days saying, hey, we beat common opponents better than Alabama did. Why are we behind them? And there's people who believe that too. The interesting point was that they decided to put Miami after Alabama and then even buffer the other guys a little bit further down when Miami doesn't have any good wins. Their losses are not horrible, by the way, because Georgia Tech and Syracuse are pretty good teams, and they're definitely better losses than like what Alabama's got. But they are behind Alabama despite having a fewer loss because they don't have any good wins. The committee is clearly enamored with what Alabama looks like when they are good, when they are at their best.
It's so strange to me because when they've been at their worst, though, they've been on the road, and they're going to have to go on the road to play a first-round game. Like, I think that should come into consideration if we're going to talk about what teams look like in certain situations as part of the reason why we're going to give them the nod. The South Carolina thing, too, like, I understand the head-to-head. We're talking about 2 points to Alabama here, right? Like, that was a game that easily could have gone the other way. Like, I know the head-to-head has to matter, but I'm also sitting here like we're far enough away from it that I could explain away fairly easily a 2-point loss to this Alabama team, in particular with the way that they have looked as of late, as you mentioned. Lenora Sellers is a guy who you feel like you have a chance in any game when he's playing well. Like they're one of the teams that I do feel like a lot of people are going to look and say, what if they actually did make it in? We feel like they could make noise.
Yeah, they're the team that like you would think would be the last teams into a model like this that got hot late, that was playing their best football late in the season. I'm with you. It's interesting because like usually we say an early loss in the season is better than a late one, right? And that's worked out really well for Notre Dame. Alabama had a bad loss late and it didn't matter. So it's like inconsistent across the teams that the committee is evaluating. One other note that we were waiting to see, I think kind of the secondary question coming into the penultimate rankings was how far Ohio State would fall. As you mentioned, they only fell 4 spots. They are the number 8 seed because of how the seeding works. So they do host Tennessee in this situation. Tennessee fans have been very upset about this possibility all week. And I don't even think it's a question. Ohio State has 2 top 10 wins. And those are better than what Tennessee has. Tennessee has a bad loss to Arkansas. Ohio State has a bad loss to Michigan. They cancel each other out. So to me, that makes a lot of sense. And I think if you're Ohio State, you're feeling great that you can maintain this spot, hopefully, when it's Selection Sunday and get to host a game in the first round, which I think is the best case scenario after that, embarrassing loss to Michigan.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the top 10 wins. Like the real idealistic people when it comes to Ohio State would also mention going on the road to play at Oregon and losing by 1 point as like how good we believe that they can be when they're really clicking. And certainly Tennessee has had their moments, but like there's not that, they don't have necessarily that litmus test, that kind of data point of like going toe to toe with the number 1 team in the country. So I think this makes sense in terms of Ohio State still being ahead of Tennessee based off of the way that the season's played out. To your point, both of the losses very ugly. I think we put those to the side when you're looking at these 2 teams specifically and weigh everything else that's happened.
So as we sit here with 1 set of rankings to go, the real rankings, and a couple of conference championship games to go, it's interesting to see Boise State's positioning. They still remain really well positioned to get the number 4 overall seed, which comes with a first round bye. So they're number 10 in the rankings. And then again, the 4th seed, we're kind of starting to get a hang of this. Now they're going to be playing number 20 UNLV in the Mountain West Championship game. Winner of that game is clearly going to be in the playoff. That winner of that game will be higher ranked than the American champion, et cetera, I think. So if it's Boise State, they're already for a couple weeks now been projected into that number 4 seed ahead of the Big 12 champion. And I think it's going to stay that way because you've got Arizona State and Iowa State, number 15 and number 16. I think they could move up a few spots, but the committee likes Boise State, right? This is one of the brand names that the committee is comfortable with. They've had them in this high range for weeks now, despite the fact that they played a Mountain West schedule, despite the fact that they've struggled in some of those games and their defense isn't very good. That has not limited them. So I think you've got to feel pretty good if you're a fan of Boise State about maintaining that first round bye if you take care of business this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, that's the big if, right? Like it's either you're getting the first round bye or you're not in at all. Right. Like, and I think that's kind of the way it's come down to. The other thing, too, when going to look at Boise State, once again, like looking at the body of work, on the road at Oregon, 3-point loss. I mean, they played Oregon as well as anybody in the country has all year long. And so I do think that comes into factor when the committee's looking at like how comfortable are we with Boise State. It's like, well, they had a chance against the best team in the country.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. That is their only loss right now. But the margin for error for the group of 5 teams, They all know it. They all knew it at the
Yes.
beginning of the year. I talked to Barry Odom about this back in September. Like you're setting yourself up with what you do in the non-conference, but you still have to go win your conference championship. So
Right.
now that moment is finally coming for Boise State and UNLV as well, which they could punch a ticket into the CFP as well. The other projected top seeds, again, still need to win their conference champions. So right now, as we're looking at the bracket, it's Oregon at number 1, Texas number 2, SMU at number 3, and then again, Arizona State in at 12 because they're actually outside of the top 12 in the ranking right now, but the 5th champion is guaranteed a spot. All of those teams still have to win their conference championship game. Of that grouping, I think we're pretty confident, and by pretty confident, I mean like 99.9% sure Oregon and Texas are going to be in the final bracket, even if they lose the Big Ten, the SEC championship games. How do we feel about SMU? They checked in at the number 8 in the rankings. There are a couple teams, Indiana and Alabama, in as at-larges behind them. Is that enough wiggle room that if SMU were to lose to Clemson, that they stay in the bracket?
Listen, I'm looking at SMU. They would be a 2-loss team if they lost in the conference championship. That's the extra game that other teams don't have to play. Alabama, sorry, bro. You got to go. Right, I would keep them in here, and I love the way that SMU has played. When they made the quarterback switch to Jennings, it felt like it was a team that was hitting its stride. They've got athletes everywhere. They've been a different team defensively than in the past. Like for me personally, I would feel confident still in having them in the final bracket over an Alabama team that's been a roller coaster all year long.
I am with you completely, and I hope that's what the committee does. First of all, I also think SMU is going to beat Clemson, but Clemson the only team I think that could be a true bid thief, because if SMU is in either way, then Clemson is knocking Alabama out as that final team by winning the ACC. But I also am with you. And if the committee last year said that FSU was a different team after they lost their starting quarterback, then the committee should say, oh, SMU is undefeated with this quarterback to date, right? Like they should go both ways on that credit if we're talking about personnel and decisions. So that's going to be really interesting to watch. Now, Joshua, one of the craziest moments, I think, in the history of the CFP and the chairman, who usually try not to say anything quotable or anything interesting, happened on Tuesday night. Warde Manuel, the chair of the selection committee, said, he was pressed on this by Reese Davis. So good on Reese for like kind of following up on this. But he said that the teams that are not playing in conference championship games are basically set. They're not going to be reseeded. They're not going to be reorganized. They're not really going to be reevaluated because their resumes are complete. So what that means in layman's terms is like Alabama's in unless there's a bid thief. Miami is out. First team out, you're going to stay out because you're going to stay behind Alabama. Ole Miss, you're also out because you're going to stay behind Miami and Alabama. And South Carolina as well. You guys are all stuck in that order because none of you are playing in conference championship games, and the committee is not going to reevaluate that. I was surprised to hear that, even if that is how they were going to operate. But the fact that they're not going to factor in what happens to teams that played some of those teams is surprising.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the case for me. Like, I don't think we should willy-nilly move teams around where the game that's being played this upcoming weekend doesn't really impact them. It's not somebody that they've played, etc. But for the case of, and we've talked about this, like, if Clemson does go on to win the ACC, I do think you have to look at South Carolina and say they beat the ACC champion, right? Like, is there something there where they should be a team that could sneak in as an at-large team? I would look, again, you want to talk about, Alabama be out, unless if there's a bid thief, they would be out. If Georgia loses to Texas, how do we feel about Alabama? Is that's one of their best wins, and they're a 3-loss team. How do we feel about that? Now Georgia has a 3rd loss. These are the situations where I think they should open up the conversation. I'm not saying wholesale change the bracket, but to say that none of the teams that are playing over the weekend can move based off of the weekend's results feels like we're not taking into consideration this idea of how we view teams after wins and losses.
I always would put it this way when I would cover college basketball and talk about the bubble, that like nothing happens in a vacuum. So, you're rooting for certain results, you're rooting against other results, but it's all interconnected. basically Warde Manuel said it's not interconnected for these teams. And I'm with you on South Carolina because I think South Carolina, like if it was an eye test and we didn't have these head-to-head results that the committee is like really strictly adhering to, they would probably be in. I think they could be the last team in. But the fact that they wouldn't get more credit for a win over Clemson after Clemson won the ACC and they just beat them. Recency bias. Like this is the team that they are right now with Lenora Sellers. That wouldn't factor in. It would be really disappointing. And I'm okay with the fact that like, okay, let's see if Oregon got upset or Texas loses, like, just the seeding being affected or the numbers and the rankings sliding up and down, or Penn State, if they lose to Oregon, I think they'd still probably have a really good chance to host a game, but they might slide down a little bit like that. I'm good with, but I don't understand how you would not want to factor in common opponents and other results when you do that every other week of this process.
The South Carolina thing is really killing me. We just went over the Clemson potentially win the ACC scenario. I mentioned their loss to Alabama, and I'm thinking back to their loss to LSU and how poor the officiating was, and like how big of an impact that had in the game. And it's just like, we need to look at this team very differently. We're so obsessed with how many L's they have, right? Like, what is the win-loss? And I don't think it's that black and white when it comes to that team specifically, but that's a whole tangent for a different show.
Yeah, I think that what this does with Warde saying what he said is it means that Selection Sunday's intrigue will be about the order of the teams.
Yes.
Because I think now we know pretty clear certainty. Do we know 11 teams that are in? And then that final spot depends on Clemson. If you believe SMU is in, then we believe that these are the 11 teams. If SMU and Boise State win, these are the teams that we're going to see unveiled in bracket form on Sunday. The Big 12 champ will be in there. I think it's possible that the Arizona State or Iowa State could move up to like the 11 seed, based on another top 20 win. But like we know they're not going to get a bye if it's Boise.
Right.
We feel good that they've locked it up. So there's not a ton of intrigue. I think there's a lot of inconsistency in how the committee got us to this point. But I think where they are right now, it feels predictable, even though we've never gone through this with a conference championship weekend and we don't actually know how the losers of those games are going to be handled. I think we do still feel pretty confident that like the bracket in some capacity will look like what it looks like now because it will be almost all of the same teams.
I'm curious if one of these teams, and by one of these teams, I mean like if Texas no-shows again against Georgia, how do people feel like that about them? Or Penn State, who doesn't have a win to really hang their hat on, if they no-show against Oregon, like how does the committee want to handle that? Because I understand this idea of we don't want to punish people for playing the extra game, but I do think in the scenario of Texas, like the win over A&M certainly helps them, but even more for Penn State, like if you no-show, I kind of have to hold that against you.
Yeah, I think like blowouts should probably impact this considerably, but I think if there's, and again, I'll use Vegas lines for this, right? If Penn State, I don't know what the Penn State Oregon line is.
Your favorite thing, Vegas lines.
Well, I hate hypotheticals, except I'm saying like
do.
if the game goes around what we think it's going to, I don't know that you necessarily penalize the loser of those games all that much. Or if it is Texas and if it's a close loss to Georgia or closer than it was the first time, I don't know, do you treat that as two separate losses? Do you treat, like how do you handle some of this? But I think blowout losses are probably fair game. And I think that applies to SMU as well, even though we'd like to see them stay in the bracket. I'd be surprised, by the way, if they get blown out by Clemson. But
Oregon's favored by 3.5 against Penn State, by the way.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So if it's a close game, I mean, I don't think that really changes much of our perception of either team if they end up playing to about how we feel that they should. Playing an additional game that these other teams they're going to be compared to for at-large spots are not playing. Right. So it's going to be interesting because, again, we have not gone through this before. This is the first year of the 12-team playoff. Don't know how losses are going to impact seeding. But Warde Manuel did tell us that the teams that are not playing are going to be in the order that they're in right now. So that's pretty interesting
We'll see.
And we'll see if that actually holds up, or if he was being a little bit too transparent with us and that ends up riling people up. The politicking will continue. There will still be arguments made in media between now and Sunday, but Joshua and I will be all over it. We'll be back with our normal show on Thursday, and then we will have a special Selection Sunday show as well. For Rushing the Field, for Joshua Perry, I'm Nicole Auerbach, and we will see you soon.